Welcome you all. Welcome to everyone who is here in the Stone Center and everyone who is somewhere on Zoom. This is really our very first true hybrid event of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. So welcome to the Kaplan-Brauer Lecture of 2021. My name is Ruth von Bernus, and besides being the director of the center, I teach in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literature. I would like to use this occasion to thank you all for your support you have shown us through the pandemic and over the last 18 years. And please know that we also need your support in the future, we will celebrate the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies 20th anniversary next year. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our distinguished speaker tonight. Beth Berkowitz is a scholar of Jewish and religious studies with a specialization in classical rabbinic literature. Before becoming the Ingeborg Rennert Chair of Jewish Studies at Barnard College, she was professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America from 2004 to 2012. Among many articles and edited books she published, she's also the author of Execution and Invention, Death Penalty Discourse in Early Rabbinic and Christian Cultures from 2006, Defining Jewish Difference from Antiquity to the Present from 2012, and Animals and Animality in the Babylonian Talmud from 2018. She is, as my colleague Andrea Cooper said, the leading expert in animal studies. Her work concentrates on the experience of pleasure in animals as the Babylonian Talmud conceives it, and she is also working on a project called Biblical Bestiary that profiles the reception history of various animal characters in the Hebrew Bible. We are very honored that Beth chose the Triangle as her first in-person destination after, or I probably should unfortunately say during the pandemic. So please let me welcome Beth to her talk, Birds Are Dead, Babysitters and Hats.
So it is so nice to be here at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm really grateful to be invited to share work with you. I've had such a welcoming reception here, and I just love it here. So it's just really exciting to be here with you tonight and to talk with you about my topic. So there's a video on YouTube that did not exactly go viral. The last time I checked, it had 53 visits. You'll see why in a minute. It's called Yoni's Mom Does Shiluach Hakan. The video shows a woman, presumably the mother of someone named Yoni, struggling to scare a pigeon off her porch. Yoni's mom is the one who looks scared, though, as she stamps her foot and claps in the pigeon's direction. Does she succeed in getting the pigeon off her porch? Let's watch the video and find out.
He's gonna go in my face.
No, he won't. Did he go into our face?
No.
He walks right across.
No, but it didn't like the way you are.
No, because you're scaring him. You don't want to scare
Lock
him.
myself in here with a bird.
Okay. He doesn't.
It doesn't fear me.
No,
enough.
walk.
Smack your foot.
Walk
I
to.
don't want to.
Shall I walk it?
No, how'd you do this? Go.
It'll go.
Shoot.
It's about to go.
Oh my god. Please go. Oh my god, I'm really scared.
It's going. It's just go a little bit.
I feel claustrophobic.
If you walk
Just
closer
walk
to it, it'll move.
Closer to
Where is
it.
it gonna go? In my face?
No, of
Down-
course
down
not.
there.
You didn't see the way it went.
Can you help me out?
I hope it doesn't go in your face.
It walked towards
my
that.
God.
I'm kidding.
Oh my god. It's taking me there. Please just leave. People downstairs are like, what is happening? Please just go, everyone. Why is it taking so long? Okay, this thing has no fear.
Okay, I've been here, done.
Has no fear in it. Has no fear at all.
really amazing.
Where is it?
Okay, now you walk there and he'll go right there.
Oh,
See?
went out. It went out.
Okay.
So yes, she did succeed. Uni's mom is performing the commandment known as Shiloh Hakan, literally sending of the nest. The mitzvah's origin is in Deuteronomy. If you happen upon a bird's nest along the road, in any tree or on the ground, with chicks or eggs, and the mother is sitting over the chicks or on the eggs, do not take the mother with her children. Send off the mother and take the children for yourself, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. In other words, one must first shoo away the mother bird before taking her chicks or her eggs from the nest. This commandment is found with miscellany of civil, criminal, and family laws in Deuteronomy. The bird commandments concerned with respect for parents evokes the law of the insubordinate son, which is found in the preceding chapter of Deuteronomy. This mother bird commandment also is probably more explicitly connected thematically to the dogs, to the 10 Commandments: honor thy father and mother, which is found in Deuteronomy 5:16, which offers the same promise of prosperity and long life that the mother bird commandment does. It is that reward that Uni's mom is seeking, as are the many other people, if you do a YouTube search, who are performing this commandment in videos on YouTube. It's mostly ultra-Orthodox rabbis in the company of their followers. The mitzvah has generated something of a cottage industry, with charges of up to $500 or $600 to have someone come pick you up at your home and take you to a nesting spot. It's an awkward, even comical mitzvah, which I think you saw. People shake sticks and screwdrivers at pigeons who are nesting in the crevices of urban landscapes. They climb rickety ladders to reach nests whose contents are sometimes a surprise. There's one video where a rabbi has climbed a ladder to take a nest from the upper reaches of a building. He exclaims with surprise when he looks in the nest and he finds a fully hatched chick sitting there. This is actually stills from this video. One of the boys to whom the rabbi shows the chick, you can see, he looks alarmed as the rabbi turns to the assembled boys and he blesses each one. The fearful boy shouts, "You're gonna kill her!" And he means the bird. On another video, a father pulls out a bird's nest from behind a light that's attached to a wall, and he asks his children, "Who wants to see the eggies?" And there's someone on YouTube who comments, "Where's PETA?" So the path from Deuteronomy to Uni's mom's porch is plotted through a passage in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a canonical late antique compilation of Jewish law and lore. The sages taught, if you happen upon a bird's nest, what teaching does the verse convey? Since it is stated, send off the mother and take the children for yourself. Is it possible that one should search in the mountains and hills in order to find a nest? The verse states, if you happen upon, when it befalls you. So this reading of the Deuteronomy verse actually poses kind of a rhetorical question. Should one seek out a bird's nest in order to perform this mitzvah, this commandment? Of course not, answers this exegesis, this midrash. one performs this mitzvah only should it become relevant. In the same way that you return the lost ox of your fellow only if the ox gets lost, which is actually just a few verses before in Deuteronomy. So the Midrash's intentionally implausible reading of the verse is actually by a fluke taken by modern audiences of the Talmud, modern audiences to be the Talmud and the biblical verses' intended meaning, however. This counterintuitive reading of the Deuteronomy verse, that you actually should go out to find a bird's nest just to fulfill this mitzvah, was inspired by the Jewish mystical work, the Zohar, which envisions the suffering of the mother bird as catching God's notice, who will then fill with compassion to redeem Israel. By the 18th century, evidently, it had become popular to seek out opportunities to perform this mitzvah, but a lot of rabbis actually objected to the practice. Contemporary writers on this mitzvah critique the practice. So Natan Slifkin, who's a promoter of Jewish rationalism, he says this is a pursuit of personal reward. This is not service of God. And Kabbalah scholar, Jewish mysticism scholar David Seidenberg, criticizes this practice as truly perverse. It's contrary to common sense and to ethical human development. So, okay, my purpose in this talk is neither, as Shakespeare said, to bury the practice nor to praise it, but to use it as an opportunity to rethink the treatment of animal kinship in rabbinic tradition. There are 3 other commandments in the Torah, the Pentateuch, aside from the mother bird commandment, that center on animal family bonds. Do not cook a kid in his mother's milk. Keep a baby animal with the mother for the first week of life. And do not slaughter an animal parent and child on the same day. Here's a paradox in these laws, which is the peculiar combination of compassion and cruelty. What happens when the mother bird returns to her nest to find that her chicks or her eggs have vanished? Is slaughtering an animal parent and child on different days any more compassionate than doing so on the same day? Does cooking a kid in oil or water make the end of that young goat's life any less untimely than when he's cooked in milk? The medieval thinker Maimonides quipped that had God wanted us to show compassion for animals, he wouldn't have permitted us to slaughter them. So here's the plan for my talk. After discussing the dominant perspective on the mother bird that associates it on this mitzvah, that associates it not just with good luck, as we've seen, but also with compassion, I proceed to my main aim, which is to showcase rabbinic texts from the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud tractate called Kulin that have been underrepresented, underdiscussed, in my view. Texts that feature neither good luck, nor compassion, nor actually anything human at all. Really, the rabbinic texts that I'm discussing show an interest in birds as ingenious builders, as fathers and not just mothers, as caretakers and altruists, as rebel spirits who resist captivity, even unto the point of death. And finally, in birds as co-inhabitants of the earth, whose lives are parallel to, as well as enmeshed with our own. So I offer to you today a bird-centric approach to this commandment, an effort to read it in a spirit of anti-anthropocentrism. To do this, I will draw on an animal studies scholar Matthew Kolarko's notion of the indistinction, which I'll turn to in my conclusion. So the greatest power of the mother bird mitzvah, according to certain Jewish interpretive traditions, is actually not to confer a good life, as Yoni's mom and these various rabbis are seeking, and many other people, but it's actually to teach a person how to live a good life. Religious studies scholar Aaron Gross has called this mitzvah one of the rachamim traditions, designed to cultivate rachamim, or compassion, which comes from the Hebrew word for womb, rechem. And embedded is the idea that motherly care is the model and the source for empathy and compassion. So Gross sees these rachamim traditions as lacing together, and I'm quoting him, concerns about animal death and birth, a mandate not to cause animals to suffer, respect for animal bonding with mothers, a valorization of human and divine rachamim, and the meaning of being a Jew. So I think Maimonides is actually really helpful for explaining this approach. For in these cases, it could be a little hard to read, I understand. For in these cases, animals feel very great pain. There being no difference regarding this pain between man and the other animals. For the love and the tenderness of a mother for her child is not consequent upon reason, but upon the activity of the imaginative faculty, which is found in most animals, just as it is found in man. This is also the reason for the commandment to let the mother go from the nest. For in general, the eggs over which the bird has sat and the young that need their mother are not fit to be eaten. If then the mother is let go and escapes of her own accord, she will not be pained by seeing that the young are taken away. In most cases, this will lead to people leaving everything alone, for what may be taken is in most cases not fit to be eaten. If the law takes into consideration these pains of the soul, in the case of beasts and birds, what will be the case with regard to the individuals of the human species as a whole? So, what has he just done here? First, he claims that motherly love is common to humans and to animals. He then proposes that if the mother doesn't see the removal of her young, she won't suffer. Next, Maimonides speculates that most of the time people aren't going to end up taking the eggs or the chicks since they don't make good food anyway. In the last step, Maimonides invokes a long-standing approach to the question of having compassion for animals, which is that it's not just good for animals, but it's good for people. So it's similar to the popular idea, I'm sure you've heard this, that future serial killers or school shooters can be identified early on by their torture of animals. So this line of thought presumes that animals are kind of like the training ground for people, which does assume that the fully deserving recipients of compassion are people. So this paragraph from the Guide for the Perplexed lays out the main tracks within the compassion approach to this commandment, an approach whose foundations were laid in antiquity by the 1st century CE Jewish philosopher Philo. Surprisingly, in the classical rabbinic tradition, this approach actually doesn't find much expression. Mishnah Brachos 5:3, in fact, forbids a person from associating this commandment with divine compassion. One who says, "May your mercy reach the nest of a bird," they silence him. In the explanation of this Mishnah found within the Palestinian Talmud, this prayer formula, "May your mercy reach the nest of a bird," insults God's compassion, actually, by implying that God exercises it only towards certain creatures and not towards others. In the Babylonian Talmud, one rabbi tries to explain it by saying that the ascription of the mother bird commandment to God's mercy could pit God's creatures against each other. And another rabbi just says we shouldn't be trying to figure out God's dictates. We should just follow that. So, a story, though, in Babylonian Talmud that features a prayer leader invoking God's compassion for the mother bird and actually then being praised suggests that this compassionate approach does actually take root in rabbinic sources, but it was like the minor approach and kind of a suppressed approach and rejected. So the two approaches, one that advocates compassion, the other that actually rejects that rationale, both find expression in Maimonides, as the Jewish medieval philosopher and lawmaker, both find expression in his writing, curiously enough. Since you saw in the previous slide, he advocates this rationale of compassion, but in his other works, in his commentary to the Mishnah, in his legal work, the Mishnah Torah, he actually objects to the compassion rationale. And that really confuses a lot of interpreters of Maimonides. But what I want to point out is that there's a shared conceptual framework to all of these approaches, which is an overarching anthropocentrism. So whether the mother bird confers good luck, or trains people to be better people, or teaches you how to think about God's law, it's teaching some lesson to us, how to be, how to act, how to believe. So in the subsequent discussion, I turned to rabbinic interpretation of the mother bird mitzvah that offers an alternative pedagogy, an alternative approach, one that teaches people not how to think about themselves, each other, and God, but actually how to think in new ways about birds. Do we have in the audience any bird enthusiasts? Because that's great, because I'll need your feedback, because I actually had to learn a lot about birds to put this together and to think this through. So it's actually really helpful to have people to give feedback who are knowledgeable. Nests are having a renaissance in a trend known as biomimicry. Architects look to nature for inspiration. Any structure we make is a nest, says Janine Benyus, a biologist who studies biomimicry. Some architects design buildings that actually look like birds' nests, such as South African designer Porky Heffer's human tree nest, or New York architect Michael Perry's affordable apartments that are attached to the side of the buildings. That's actually just a mock-up. Or the gargantuan Beijing National Stadium, which locals dubbed the bird's nest for reasons I think you can tell. Birds actually don't spend very much time in their nests. Nests are essentially egg containers. And when breeding season is over, they don't need them anymore. But bird nests are ingenious in design, diverse in size and location, eclectic in materials, and extraordinarily adapted to their environment. Now, the architectural talent of birds does not go unnoticed in rabbinic texts. The Tosefta is a parallel work to the Mishnah, both of which are rabbinic law collections from like the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE in Roman Palestine. Tosefta Hulin speaks of multiple locations in which birds build nests. One who finds a nest in pits, ditches, or caves is permitted with respect to theft, but they're liable for sending. So the concern in this legislation is the applicability of the mother bird mitzvah to nests that are not found specifically, quote unquote, along the road in any tree or on the ground, because that's the phrasing of Deuteronomy. According to Peter Goodfellow's survey of nest construction, the sites that the Tosefta mentions, pits, ditches, caves, are in fact nesting sites selected by many bird species. Shore nesting plovers and the common eider dig shallow scrape nests out of the ground in open habitat. Eastern meadowlarks conceal their dome nests in depressions in the ground. And I hope you can tell in the pictures these different kinds of nests. Bee-eaters, great hornbills, and burrowing owls dig or find holes and tunnels in which to build their nests in order to protect their young from predators and from bad weather. The Babylonian Talmud explores other bird nesting locations and habits. So pigeons of a dovecot or pigeons of an attic who nested in wall crevices or in buildings, and geese and chickens who nested in an orchard, one is obligated in sending. But those who nested inside the house and likewise Hard-to-stay-in pigeons, one is exempt from sending. So let me explain the legal principle here. These are a lot of legal texts. We're going to get to some stories too. So the principle is that birds who reside more or less within the households don't fall within the scope of this mitzvah because you don't happen upon them, which is Deuteronomy's language. But should those birds nest freely in locations like a wall crevice, a nearby building, or an orchard, then they become subject to the mother bird teaching, and you do have to send off the mother bird. So the Talmud mentions also nests on the sea and in the air. As Rav Yehuda said, Rob said, if one found a nest in the sea, one is obligated in the mitzvah of sending. As it is stated, so said the Lord, who makes a way in the sea. If that is so, one found a nest in the sky, about which it is written, the way of an eagle in the sky. One should also be obligated in sending away from the nest. The sky is called the way of an eagle, but it is not called the way in an unspecified manner. So let me explain. The Rabbi Rav, that's his name, questions whether nests in the sea and sky fall within the scope of the mother bird commandment. The sea, but not the sky, concludes the Talmud, count as the road that Deuteronomy mentions. And the Talmud reads Deuteronomy in conjunction with verses from Isaiah and Proverbs, all of which use this same term, derech, or road. So should one think these scenarios are just the product of rabbinic imagination, Peter Goodfellow's book on avian architecture is instructive, and it's the source for these really nice photos that you're seeing. So some bird species, jacanas, marsh terns, grebes, rails, are quote-unquote specialist architects who build nests that either rest on a waterbed, float as islands, or roam as rafts. Ornithologist Howard Saunders, back in 1899, apparently reported an aquatic nest that was firm enough to support a seated man who was up to his knees in water. The nests in the air are even more impressive. Species like the osprey take years to build nests up on platforms, and they repair them when needed. The white stork builds nests on chimneys and utility poles. Some weavers and orioles build their nests dangling. It looks like magic to me, just in the air. Careful binding, weaving, and knotting provide the support for these hanging nests. The Talmud also considers the materials that birds use to pad the nest. Rabbi Yeremiah poses a question. A rag, what is the law? Does it interpose? Feathers, what is the law? Does it interpose? So let me explain. The mother must be, this is Deuteronomy, sitting over the chicks or on the eggs. So, question, what if there's something in between? That's what Rabbi Yeremiah asks. Does the command still apply? It's a technical point. The Talmud's famous for technical points. But the question of interposition of something in between motivates Rabbi Yeremiah to consider the means by which birds build their nests. When read avian-centrically, the text shed light on the rich and diverse nesting habits of birds, located in pits, ditches, cisterns, caves, gardens, residential interiors, as well as in hospitable spots, in walls, corners, and crevices, made up of found objects like rags and their own bodies, feathers. The nests that appear in the Talmud testify to the ingenuity, agility, and versatility of their builders. Okay, so moving on. The mother bird plays the starring role in Deuteronomy 22:6-7. Just a quote, the mother is sitting over the chicks, don't take the mother, send off the mother. But what about the father? He doesn't even make a cameo appearance in Deuteronomy. Yet, in the lived reality of bird families, not to mention the charmingly imagined penguin family of Happy Feet, you've seen that movie, the father is far from an absent figure. There's some cute penguins. So one of the distinguishing features of birds among vertebrates is their biparental care norm. In 90 to 95% of bird species, both parents are involved in direct care of the young. Male and female birds are equally able to build a nest and incubate and feed chicks. And if bird fathers don't help out, the chicks have a greatly diminished chance of survival. And in some bird species, kiwis, cassowaries, moorhens, males are the exclusive or dominant caretakers. So rabbinic texts do ask about the father's role. The Mishnah features a dispute about whether the male and the bird in Hebrew is called the koreh, which according to scholars who try to identify these ancient words with species that we know, has been identified with the sand partridge. This koreh is subject to the command of sending off the mother bird, the male koreh. So you can see here a male koreh, Rabbi Eliezer obligates while the sages exempt. So in other words, what happens when quote unquote the mother bird of Deuteronomy is actually a father? Then, according to the sages, the mitzvah no longer applies. But Rabbi Eliezer dissents, saying that the male partridge qualifies. The Mishnah elsewhere, though, implies that it's really the mother bird who's the primary figure. So just as the eggs need their mother, so too do fledglings need their mother. Excluded from the commandment are young birds who have already fledged. Here, the Mishnah is interested in young birds who are already able to fly. And it says that the mother bird command ceases to apply to those birds. But what's interesting to me is even though scientific data suggests that bird survival is generally dependent upon both parents, the Mishnah's representation here of bird parenthood really privileges the mom and kind of invisibilizes the dad. And you see this happening actually also with humans. So for instance, in Mishnah's Sukkah, which is about the fall festival booths, it says women, slaves, and minors are exempt from the Sukkah. A minor who doesn't need his mother is obligated in the Sukkah. So once a child, a boy, no longer needs his mother, he becomes obligated to dwell in the sukkah. But I'm kind of interested in just that rhetoric of maternal dependence. And what we're seeing is that the father, the sibling, other caretakers kind of fall away in this narrative of development in which the mother is the figure upon whom the child depends. But the male partridge, for some reason, doesn't really fade into the background in the same way that other bird fathers do. The Talmud actually wonders at his persistence. So actually, I wanted to go back to this slide because I didn't get a chance to talk about this. So Rabbi Abahu said, what's the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer? A verbal analogy between brooding and brooding. It is written here as the koreh that broods over young that he has not brought forth, and it is written there. There shall the great owl make her nest and lay and hatch and brood under her shadow. This is kind of a complicated exegetical thing, but it's the shared use of this verb for incubation, digirah, that's being used in both Jeremiah and Isaiah. It's said to be the inspiration for why Rabbi Eliezer includes the male partridge in this mitzvah. Not a positive image in either Jeremiah or Isaiah. We should know it's part of an apocalyptic fantasy of vengeance, at least in Jeremiah. And just kind of make the picture worse for bird dads, the male koreh, kind of moving forward again, is an exception even for Rabbi Eliezer. If you look in the Tosefta and the Talmud, where it says explicitly that the male koreh, this partridge, is the only male bird that becomes subject to dispute. So a male, one is exempt from sending, but with a male koreh, you have this dispute. So even though the male bird may incubate eggs, feed chicks, protect them, he does not satisfy the requirements of the commandments according to the Tosefta and the Talmud. The Mishnah, for whatever reason, is a little more ambiguous on the father's status. Still, the father bird kind of isn't so easily booted out of the Talmud. You see here a male on top of the eggs and a female bird on top of the male. What is the law? The dilemma shall stand. Let me explain. This passage, it poses the same problem. I don't know if you how quickly you catch on to intricate legal text, but it poses the same problem of the interposition that we saw before with rags and feathers. So the idea is if there's something in between the mother bird and the eggs, she's not really technically sitting on top of them. So does the command still apply? Here, it's the father bird who interposes himself lying on top of the eggs, forming a barrier between the mom and the chick. So the question of whether the mitzvah still applies is left open, as is the question of the dad's precarious status within the bird family. But the image, I think, is suggestive, which is that the nest is not this place of splendid isolation of the mother with chick, but is populated by a variety of other figures. And it's to some of those figures that I want to next turn. So, like many social species, as we humans are, birds are cooperative or communal breeders with various aunts, they call them aunties and uncles, who help out with childcare. This phenomenon of cooperative breeding, referring to when the technical term cooperative breeding refers to when 3 or more individuals collectively raise a single brood or litter, has been recognized by naturalists for over 2 centuries. But with the rise of behavioral ecology in the 1960s, scientists got really curious about the evolutionary benefits of cooperative formations. Helpers at the nest, as naturalist Alexander Skutch called them, posed a paradox to evolutionary theory. because of the apparent self-sacrifice or altruism that they seem to show. There's also a less common but related phenomenon called brood parasitism, where the helper at the nest is actually the mother bird herself, who incubates and raises the egg of another species who drops their egg into the mother bird's nest. And the birds that are really famous for doing this are, anybody know by chance? Yeah, I think that's right. Also, cuckoos and cowbirds are famous for doing this. So sometimes a mother bird can end up raising an egg from a bird of a different species, or even a bird from the same species, where another bird might drop her egg in someone else's nest for them to take care of. So in addition to creative nest design, active paternal care, cooperative breeding, and brood parasitism are features of bird life that rabbinic texts address. Rabbinic discussions refer repeatedly to nests in which the eggs are not the biological offspring of the parent who's sitting on top. You can see a case in point from the Mishnah. An impure or unkosher bird, one is exempt from sending. An impure bird lying on the eggs of a pure bird lying on the eggs of an impure bird, one is exempt from sending. The Mishnah here exempts the nest in which a mother bird is sitting on top of the eggs born from the mother of a different bird species if the two species, one is pure or kosher and one is impure or unkosher. So if mother and child are both of the impure species, then they're definitely exempt. The Talmud further probes the scope of difference between quote unquote mother and child here in this text. Rabbi Zera asks, a pigeon is upon the eggs of a tasil, and we're not sure exactly what species that is. What's the law? A tasil on the eggs of a pigeon. What's the law? So in other words, what if the mother bird and the eggs upon which she sits are both of pure species? Here it's the pigeon and this species called the tasil. But they're not the same species, but they're both kosher species. Is the relationship between caretaker and child close enough to set off this mitzvah? Abaye says yes, and he draws an inference from the Mishnah. Abaye said, come in here, an impure bird lies on the eggs of a pure bird, a pure lies on the eggs of an impure bird, one's exempt from sending. Behold, a pure on a pure, one is obligated. And then the editorial voice kind of pushes back, saying perhaps it's regarding a koreh. Anyway, Abaye highlights the Mishnah's concern with purity and impurity, and he infers beyond that distinction about purity, mother and eggs, to just be taken as a package deal. So long as they're both from kosher species, they should be considered a pair for the purposes of this commandment. And the Talmud tries to object, bringing up a koreh in response, but it's a little clear how that objection works, so I don't want to get into it. But what I want to say is that these texts are asking what it means for a mother and child to count as such. The texts surprisingly take for granted that an adult and child of the same species, when found together in the nest, count as mother and child when they may not be biologically related, as is the case with a helper auntie. Perhaps the rabbis didn't know as much about cooperative breeding, or figured that a passerby couldn't be expected to tell if birds of the same species are biologically related. But the Talmud takes as its premise that nests might be occupied by any number of unrelated individuals. The nest, as the rabbis understand it, is, you could say, like a queer space, one in which the mother need not be a breeder, families don't need to be made up of kin relations. So these kind of queer bird families are just like a kind of assumption of the rabbinic discussion. Okay, cooperative breeding requires birds to abide by complex behavioral codes that what we in the human world call morality. A good indicator of the presence of a moral code is when individuals feel pressure to hide their violations. And I think you can think of plenty of examples of that from the human world. But scientists have found examples actually from other species as well. So Australian ornithologists Michael Double and Andrew Cockburn have documented female superb fairy wrens who are really beautiful, flying off in secret in the early morning to engage in a quick sexual liaison. In another case from Australia, white-winged choughs help to feed their compatriots chicks, but as soon as the compatriots nest, they snatch the food back and gulp it down themselves. Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy says these birds pay to stay, and occasionally they only pretend to pay at that. So a moral universe in which birds sometimes play by the rules and sometimes flout them, whether brazenly or on the down low, actually also appears in rabbinic texts. The flouting is explicit in rabbinic texts that actually talk about birds using the language of rebellion. The Hebrew root is memre shalad, and they use that to describe birds who leave domestic spaces. So the Tosefta talks about geese, chickens, and doves who leave human spaces as rebelling, and says you're still obligated in sending from the nest. And this rebellion rhetoric is really interesting. It points to a whole world of assumptions that birds are properly controlled by people when they leave human domiciles. It's considered a revolt. And we use that same term to talk about a Jew who rebels against rabbinic norms. And you get punished for that with something called makat mardut, which is that same root. It's a flogging of rebellion. Or if a wife doesn't do for her husband what she's supposed to, or a husband doesn't do for her wife what she's supposed to, that's called a mered or a meredet, same root, rebellion. Bird rebellion might even reach the level of homicide. As we see, actually, I want to get back, in the next Talmudic text, Ravina said, a pure bird who kills a person, one is exempt from sending. What's the reason? As the verse states, you shall send the mother, refers to one whom you are commanded to send, which excludes this one, whom you are not commanded to send, but to bring him to court. What are the circumstances? If this is a case where his verdict was issued, he is subject to being killed. Rather, it is a case where his verdict was not yet issued, and one is required to bring him to the court to fulfill through him, and you shall eradicate the evil from your midst. The Talmud here presents a case where a bird has murdered a human being. That bird need not be shooed away, says the Rabbi Ravina, since other consequences await that bird, which is to say, judicial trial. And then the Talmud expresses puzzlement over this scenario. If the bird had killed somebody, you would have had to take the bird immediately to trial. So how would they have time to incubate eggs, such that this question of shooing her away could even come up? So the Talmud proposes that the question Ravina asked is about the super specific case of a bird who killed someone, but whose verdict had not yet been issued by the court. And in that case, you're not supposed to shoo her away. You're supposed to bring her to the court to fulfill the scriptural mandate to eradicate evil from your midst. Now, the Talmud scenario raises a lot of questions. Does the Deuteronomy verse really intend to exclude this very unusual case of a homicidal bird who's been tried by the court, but whose verdict has not yet been delivered. So I think even the staunchest of Talmudists is likely to admit that's not really what Deuteronomy is about. Then there's also the matter, I imagine you're asking yourself this question, of bird trials. And there's actually been a lot of scholarship devoted to the fascinating phenomenon of animal trials, which exists in rabbinic tradition in the Bible, or not in the Bible explicitly, but also in medieval European history. But the question that actually most interested me when I first read this text is how a bird could kill a person in the first place. And so I actually did a little Googling, and I found that there are instances of birds killing people. Cassowaries have a reputation for it, ostriches do too, but it is rare. So I'm just trying to keep track of the time. I think I should start to wrap up because we mostly started on that. So I'm going to skip to my conclusion. Okay. So I want to come to a close. Rabbinic texts speak birds who are builders, dads, helpers, killers, and a little bit I skipped was also rebels. There's a story about birds. Oh, actually, I did talk about rebels. The last text to which I turn features birds in yet another role, and it's going to sound strange, as hats. The Papunian said to Rav Matana, "One found a nest on the head of a person. What's the law?" He said, "An earth upon his head." So people from the village called Papunya posed to Rav Matana a question. Does the mother bird command still apply if the nest is located on top of a person's head? Does that still qualify as like being on the road? Because that's what Deuteronomy describes as the location of the nest. So like the passage on homicidal birds, this one inspires, at least for me, a host of questions. Why would a person let a bird build a nest on top of their head? How does the nest stay on? The Talmud's answer to the question is terse, citing without elaboration this snippet from 2 Samuel, "an earth upon his head," which is describing King David's mourning as he encounters his son Absalom's rebellion. According to medieval Talmud commentator Rashi's explanation of the Talmud, what he says is the fact that the dust on David's head is called ground by the Bible suggests that a human head, even though it's far off the ground, can still be considered ground, technically, so that the mother bird mitzvah applies even when the nest is on top of someone's head. So in the continuation of the Talmud, the Papunians pose a series of really crazy questions, and the whole passage kind of has a fantastical tone, which suggests that the head bird nest is intended in a similar spirit. But I think a serious insight lies there regarding the entanglement of human lives with animal lives and the displacement of the human that comes along with seeing that. In the image of the nest as hats, the human head becomes the ground, the foundation that facilitates animal families and homes, serving animal needs rather than the other way around. When the chicks hatch, the human head is left behind, its purpose served. Or alternative, maybe the human and bird stay in touch. So Matthew Calarco's concept of the indistinction is helpful for visualizing this head bird nest scenario, as well as other ones that the Talmud features. The Talmud's head bird nest displaces anthropocentric ways of being, opening up affirmative possibilities for other ways of life. So to the appreciation for avian architecture that the Talmud expresses, its interest in the gender dynamics of the nest, in these queer bird families, and in the revolt of freedom-seeking birds. The very notion of the mother bird could be seen as subverting human-animal dualism by imagining a motherhood that transcends species. We need new ideas, says Calarco, new practices that resist the status quo, but also that allow for other forms of life and relations to emerge. Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, Pauline, offer new ideas. That's what I've tried to show, that go beyond the good luck and compassion that are often associated with the mother bird mitzvah. The Talmudic texts I've discussed suggest a reality that Calarco calls indistinction, a zone of profound identity and shared exposed embodiment among human and animal. And I think no image better captures that than the Talmud's nest head. That's not to deny the anthropocentrism of the mother bird mitzvah, which presupposes a binary human-animal ontology, human exceptionalism, and a strong moral hierarchy, which are all the things Calarco associates with anthropocentrism. The mitzvah presumes that the baby bird is just there for the taking, that our obligation to the mother bird extends no further than a brief act of deception, and that human families occupy a moral and ontological space different from and superior to that of bird families. The anthropocentrism of this mitzvah, as Calarco says of the anthropocentrism more generally, is more than a conceptual apparatus. It's a robust, interlocking, complex series of discursive and material practices. But, and now I really do close, if we humans are so vain that we probably think this mitzvah is about us, that's just partly true. I've tried to show for the rabbi. As they delve into the details of this mitzvah, they're led to dwell at some length on the lives of birds and to give thick description to those lives. Emerging from this literature that I've discussed with you today is a rich and complex engagement with another species. The mother bird mitzvah has the salutary effect of shaking the rabbis and to us, hopefully, out of our ingrained anthropocentrism and pushing us towards what I think actually comes naturally as all the taking and the killing and the consuming of animals that lies at the heart of the biblical and the Jewish tradition. And what I'm referring to is instead an affinity for other species and a curiosity about other species. The mitzvah gets us out of our own heads. Or, as is the case with the head bird nest, it gets us to use our heads in new ways. From the Mishnah's partridge dad to the Talmud's nest head, to Maimonides' rationale of compassion, to Yoni's mother's porch, the mother bird mitzvah is, like the mother bird herself, on the move. The mother bird mitzvah inspires legal and exegetical elaboration, moral and theological reflection, fantastical stories and popular practices, and not least of all, as we've seen here today, appreciation for all that birds can do. Thank you.
We have time for questions, so please, we thought we will start here with the audience, and then we will move on to our many online participants as well.
First of all, thank you so much for your incredibly insightful talk. I think you've given all of us a lot to think about. I'm curious whether there are any other instances outside of interpretations and explications of Deuteronomy 22 verses 6 through 7, in which the Talmud takes on a zoocentric flair. I'm particularly interested in whether there are ever animal-centered interpretations of animal sacrifice.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Because if you actually look through the order of the Mishnah that deals with sacrifice, there's so much engagement with like the organs of the animals and with animals' anatomy And like a butcher actually has to really know a lot about animals. And it's I have a brother-in-law who works for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Massachusetts. And something I've talked a lot with him about is hunting. And, you know, as you can probably tell, I'm not the kind of person who would be like rah-rah hunting. But what I have discovered is that, like, hunters know more about animals than most of the rest of us do because they spend time with them and they're interested in their habits. And it's part of the project of hunting to get to know how animals behave. So I think even when discussions can seem kind of grim, and when you're talking about like how to disembowel an animal or how to, you know, cut its throat, at the same time you can actually see a lot of engagement with animals. I don't know if it's, you know, maybe it's not the most positive engagement, but maybe it's a start. You know, that kind of level of detailed knowledge, I think is the start.
You see some Raleigh 103s, your studies on a few students, so feel free to think about whether this evokes any questions or connections you have with the material we've been looking at. But in the meantime, I was wondering, the Mishnah, I think it was, seems to reject this, the idea of compassion, the idea that one should sort of imagine divine compassion for a bird as like a model for divine compassion in general. That's kind of odd to me. Is this part of a larger trend away from a kind of anthropomorphic theology, or what's behind that rejection?
That is a great question. And actually, if you go to the Talmudic commentary on that Mishnah, the very first question is yours. What is the reason? You know, like, why do you have to shut the person up who talks about this mitzvah as being about God's compassion? It's very strange. Because it's not just sort of avoiding thinking of this as compassion. It's like, no, you're not allowed to say that it's about compassion. There's something really objectionable to them about it. And so I can tell you what the Talmud has to say about it. I think I said a little bit about it earlier, is that maybe it suggests something negative about God. If you say God has compassion for the mother bird, then what do you do with all the other cases where maybe God doesn't seem to have compassion? You know, and then there's like a dispute, and the other rabbi says, and this is like a huge question in Jewish law and ethics, is should we be seeking the reasons for commandments? And there's a whole medieval genre of ta'amim, of looking for the reasons for God's law. And there's a lot of controversy about that very genre. Like, is it okay for us to try to understand God's law? Or is it our job to just follow it and not question kind of the logic behind it? So that's one of the approaches to this too, is maybe like we just shouldn't be attributing things to God. But I also think it's really interesting because, you know, you have Philo and you have various medieval Bible scholars who say that it is about compassion, modern Bible scholars who think that the compassion rationale is actually pretty compelling. So, but the classic, like the main rabbinic tradition was like, nope, that's not what this is about.
Hi, so we have a question from the Zoom chat. So it says, what about the practical thought that if you try to take eggs while the mother bird is on the nest, you will get pecked and perhaps attacked? Could this practical consideration be partially the source of this?
Interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking it's not an explanation I've seen. I think if you just took the biblical verse, hey, let's look at it. That's at the beginning here. Here's the one piece because that's always the question is like, maybe there's just practical reasons. Like that's the big debate about the prohibition on pork. Is like, well, you have a prohibition on pork because pigs had diseases and they didn't want people to get sick from eating pigs. And so they made it this prohibition, but really it was just to keep people healthy. So I think that's always a question about biblical laws, later laws, is do they make it sound kind of like mysterious and sacred when really it had this like practical slant? And I think it's a really good question to be asking. And it does stand to reason that, practical considerations come into play. But, you tell me what you think. But the fact that it says at the end, in order that you may fare well and have a long life, suggests there's kind of something bigger at stake than just you shouldn't do this because like you'll end up with a bunch of cuts on your arms or something like that. It suggests there's some dimension, there's some kind of deep dimension to this, and that's why at the start of my talk I pointed out that the 10th commandment about honoring one's parents has exactly that same promise at the end of it. And you could say there's practical considerations to respecting your parents too, but there's obviously more to it. So I would say it doesn't seem out of the question, but it kind of feels from the passage itself that the passage presents it as, having a little more to it than just, it's a stupid idea to do.
Is this mitzvah only applicable when you're harvesting the eggs to be eaten, or is it just harvesting them in general? Because in the videos, it seems like they're doing it towards the mitzvah, not to eat them, but often the compassion towards animals is only when they're being eaten.
That's such a good question. That comes up in a lot of the literature. Is that question of are you taking them to be eaten? And it kind of comes back to that original idea of like, does this mitzvah kind of stand alone, or is the scenario that like you're looking for food and you come across a bird's nest and that's kind of the assumed scenario by the Bible, but it's clear by the time you reach like Yoni's mom on the porch that the framework has totally shifted. And I hope you saw like she picks up the eggs and there's like a blessing you're supposed to say before that. I don't think she actually says it. And then people, what they do is they put it right back. They don't take it. So it's very strange. It's like there's no purpose to it. And it does seem like pretty nonsensical at that point. But I think you're right that the original idea does seem to assume that like Maimonides thinks like nobody would actually want chicks or eggs. I don't actually know for a fact, like are chicks and eggs something people eat? Like is it edible? Would you have to be pretty desperate for food? Like the kind of going back to the practical issues. But it seems like the assumption is that you want the chicks or eggs for whatever reason, I assume for food. And that's why you'd be taking them. And if you're going to do that, then you'd send away the mother bird. That seems to make the most sense. But you're right, by the time it evolves, it's not about that at all.
I would really like to thank you very much for coming to Chapel Hill, and I think for every one of you who came, and I know this is really, really almost at the end of the semester, and it was a long and interesting, but also sometimes difficult semester. So I would thank everyone. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you for many more events next semester.
Thanks for coming.